Hey, Ian Davis here, coming to you from Andros Island and Swains K Lodge. We had a pretty rough day on the water. We managed to catch a couple nice big fish, but we're in a little early today, and it's too early to go to shines, so we're going to tie a couple bugs for you today. A lot of these flies that we're tying were really the creation of Captain Charlie Smith, who's right here from Andros. It's kind of somewhat people believe that he was the first to put bead chain eyes on a fly. And the history of that is a lot of Brits used to come here to the Autech Navy base to do naval training. And they would bring their salmon flies and hired Charlie when he was a chef in Fresh Creek at the marina to take him bone fishing. And he was mainly an offshore captain. And he noticed that their salmon flies rode hook side down, and they kept getting snagged on the bottom because bonefish are bottom feeders. So he simply went to the bank and got some of the little bead chains that hold the pen to the desk. This is in the probably late 50s, 60s, early 70s, and he strapped them to the bottom side of the hook, so the hook would ride up and go snag free, therefore the ability to hook more bonefish. And that first fly that he co-created with Bob Nieheim was called the Nasty Charlie. And that was because it worked so well. And Crazy Charlie always said, "I'm not nasty, my fly is." And it eventually got changed to Crazy Charlie in commemorative for him. So he was a dear friend of mine, and I spent many a night tying flies with him. So we're going to tie a version of the Charlie that, because anything with bead chain eyes on it, he would say was his. But anyways, we call this, it's kind of like a little spun rabbit strip. And we used to call it the Joulters horror back in the day when we were doing a lot of DIY fishing and fishing with the Smith family and the Nemors back in the day. It's a really simple fly, and it's just like a baby shrimp. And what I like about it is this rabbit strip kind of cushions the blow when it hits the water. It lands a little quieter than a traditional fly that's got a real hard bottom to it. You can see this has got a little pillowy action to it. Really simple fly to tie, and best of all, very durable. I'm a big fan of the Gamakatsu hooks. I like the silver ones. They kind of reflect the surrounding colors. I don't think they show up as much, and they're very strong. I've had very few of these open. Nothing worse than an open hook on a big bonefish. So I trust these hooks and use them pretty much solely. I'm a big fan of the Regal Vise my whole life. I just like the ease of being able to open the jaws and close it really easily. And we'll start with just a pink thread base. You always want to create a good base on your flies. That is the foundation of the fly. I know you've all had, bonefish repeatedly eat your fly, and it's always kind of a bummer when you can't get a hook set because the eyes have spun and the hook is laying flat in the sand. Well, that doesn't do anybody any good. So I am a huge fan of over threading, wrapping, and gluing the eyes on my hook. And so in memory of Crazy Charlie, or Smitty as they called him on the island, we're going to use some good old bead chain eyes. So this fly will be good for a little bit shallower water, nothing too deep, and something that'll land a little quieter and only, maybe 1 to 3 feet of water, something like that. But we're still using a big hook. You don't have to use small flies here. You can get away with some bigger flies and stronger hooks to land the big bonefish that they have on Andros Island. And because the bottom's so clean and often, or most often, just pure white sand, that they don't get snagged as much as you get at Turniff Atoll and Belize on the reef or outside Ascension Bay where you're fishing a lot of sticky bottom. So again, I am over wrapping these eyes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, because if these eyes spin, man, it's just such a drag. And I hate to say it, but a lot of these manufacturers, none that we carry at Yellow Dog, of course, you get a cheap fly and the eye spins, and oftentimes it hasn't even hit the water yet. So we really want to make sure that these eyes are on tight. And I just do this by cross-hatching, figure eighting, and a number of different configurations to really cinch that down. And I'll pull tight with that pink Kevlar thread. And then I actually take some UV glue and paint it on the top and bottom. And before I put the UV light on it, I'll cup it and blow on it. And that gets the glue to wrap around it and impregnate the thread wraps and against the bead chain eyes. Then I just take my UV. Kind of never want to breathe in these fumes, I think. But I'll just spin it and get that UV to really set. Make sure those eyes are really, really in there tightly. All right. So we've got, and you can go through and you can tie a bunch just like this. And that's kind of production tying, where you're doing just kind of one major step at a time. You're watching the hockey game and you're sitting there and you're just kind of creating a bunch of these bases and leaving them out. And then you can kind of go from there and create different flies on top. I almost have to say that to some degree, no two flies of mine are alike, like a dead show. Anyways, so I take some of these rubber legs. I like the hot tip ones where it's kind of a clear base with some barring, like little check marks, and then a hot tip end. And that kind of imitates that spawning shrimp or gives it a more attractive color. And I always tie my legs in longer because I can always shorten them. But I don't like when, like on that one I showed you before, the legs are a little short on it. So I can always trim them up later. Rubber legs are very reasonably priced. There's no sense in skipping them out to try and stretch them out. So what I try to do is, spread these legs out a little bit so they're in a V formation like a shrimp tail, and then just tie them in tightly. Some good wraps. All right, we've got our eyes wrapped in, glued so they don't spin. We've got our tail in. I'm going to add a little of this body braid, tinsel body braid, kind of a pearlescent, and I'm going to aim it backwards so that it creates a little tail which will come up unwoven as we fish it. And it just gives it a little bit of a sparkly tail to it. And I'll wrap this in, pull it back, continue to wrap it in, and then I'll build that thread base. We want this pink thread to kind of shimmer underneath this braid so that it's kind of translucent. And then I'll just wrap the braid towards the eye of the hooks, overlapping just a little bit. And I don't have to go around the eyes on this because we're going to come over the top of this with some rabbit strip. So you won't even see most of this. It'll be kind of hidden but not behind it. But when we wrap the rabbit strip, you'll see the back of it a little bit. It'll shine through the rabbit. So I just use a kind of a basic rabbit here. It's not cross-cut. It's just straight up rabbit strips. And I like the lighter tan. Basically, you're always matching the color of the fly to the bottom of the flat. And then I just tie this in with the pinch method. Make sure it's secure behind the eyes. And I don't want to overdress this. I'm a big firm believer in my bonefish flies being sparse. Remember that everything a bonefish eats uses camouflage to not be eaten. So your fly should somewhat disappear on the bottom, and maybe just the eyes or a little bit of flash or just a couple breathing rabbit strips is what triggers the eat, or even just the fly dragging along the bottom and kicking up sand. If you overdress these flies, they stand out too much on the bottom and they're too obvious. And the fish knows that, it's fake because it's too contrasty. So I just wrap this around like a palmered style, one wrap in back and one wrap in front, and that's it. And the wonderful thing about rabbit strip is it's so durable with this leather binding at the base and then the durable fibers. Back in the day, a lot of people use calf tail for this or even marabou. And that's brittle stuff, particularly with age. Calf tail and marabou gets dried out and will break. And then we just got this wonderful, almost like a hackle deal. And then I'll actually fluff it out and I'll cut the bottom off just a little bit. So it's a little lighter in the air. And then it's just kind of more like wings. And then I spin it over, couple more wraps to secure that rabbit strip. And then I tie in some flash. This is that holographic flash, which I think looks pretty cool. And maybe, 4 to 6 strands, not too much. You don't want to over flash your flies. You want them to kind of, again, blend in. And I run this right over the top, tie it in with the pinch method. And then we always said that, the Joulters horror back in the day when Jim, Morty, and Crosby and I were waiting all these flats with Keith Parr. We would run like a little hackle on either side to be like paw marks on a shrimp or a bait fish. So I've just got some ginger quilled hackle, and I want to find the ones that have the good barring on them. And then you just run them on either side, just like, the side of a fish or a shrimp. And they're kind of like wings. It gives a little bit more action. It's kind of fun. They're not as durable as the other aspects of the fly. But honestly, I think if they fell off, it wouldn't matter. They'd still eat this fly. One interesting aspect about this fly is that we were tying it, 15 years ago, and a good buddy of mine, Doug McKnight, who's a wonderful fly tyer and one of my best buddies, he handed me some new flies he called the pig pen to test when I was going to a trip in Cuba, and it was pretty much this exact fly. So much like the fashion industry and the runways of Paris, what goes around comes around. We can get a full cycle of fashion. So this fly that we kind of thought we came up with, 15, 20 years ago, Doug came up with it again. And we used to use quills. We'd strip the feathers off a feather like this and just use the quills splayed outwards. But it wasn't very durable. Of course, Doug, being the master fly tyer, was like, just use the rubber legs. A lot more durable. And then I use a whip finisher to finish my bug. Make sure it's not tangled in there. Just give it a quick finish. Secures the thread. Cut. Make sure all these guys are out of the way. A little bit more UV head cement. Ladder up. I didn't trim this flash coming out the front, but it's actually kind of cool. I'm going to leave it. That's what's fun about fly tying. We don't want to tie our flies to look exactly like what we're trying to mimic. We want to tie our flies to be more aesthetic and create more movement in the water. A wonderful example of that is this is a clam fly tied by Crazy Charlie. And whenever you would get to the Bang Bang Club, you'd be walking down the dock and he'd look at your shirt to see your buttons. And he'd be like, man, can I get that button from you? And he would cut your button off and use it to tie a clam fly. And I have seen over the years bonefish just kind of hoovering along the bottom. And we never really knew what they were eating, and they were super tough to feed. Like, you couldn't get them to eat. And then if you really look down in there, you'd see all these little tiny white clams. Well, Charlie said, man, they be eating clams. And he'd point his finger at you, honest to God. And so he would, before you left, you always had no buttons on your shirt as long as they were white or pearl. And so this is actually an original Crazy Charlie button fly. And I can't fish it, obviously, because it means too much to me, but kind of neat. It doesn't look like a clam, but it's got lots of action to it with the flash and the tail. The little, sometimes clams have that little brown part that comes out of them. So kind of neat. Have fun with your fly tying, experiment, and, just keep them sparse.